Okay folks, welcome to video 2 of 4. This is your kind of final bit of prep really that I'm helping you with on psychology of addiction. A great topic if you ask me, and certainly one I wouldn't leave till last. But that's just me, I know it's last in the booklet, but I think it's doable, and according to like recency effects you should be better in this one really. Anyhow, let's blast through it. It should take about 30 minutes or so maximum. I'm going to, at this point now, literally just over a week before your exam, I'll point you in a few directions. Obviously you need to revise all of this on screen. There's nothing there you cannot revise, because everything and anything can come up. But just so we know, these short bits here, these short bits about describing addiction, there's been years and years and years since I've asked anything about them. When was it? Hold on. 2018. The problem is they're only short marks. So, unless they ask you an application question here, it's only going to be 4 marks maximum. But I'll be on your toes for describing addiction. Likewise, risk factors. It's been a fair few years since risk factors has come up, and it's one they enjoy asking because there's so much you could write about it. Anyhow, enough of the waffle. Let's just go through it. Now, this booklet is different to yours. It's one I did it's a staff version from 2022, but it's similar-ish, you know what I mean? You'll be able to gather what I'm talking about, okay? So like I said, define an addiction. Not that they can ask you about the stages of addiction, but just know, when people talk about addiction, it's not just one thing. There are 3 different things, isn't there? Initiation, maintenance, and relapse. So be on your toes for this. And for each of these terms, it says at the top, they can ask you for 4 marks on each of these, but that would be a bit of a waste of 4 marks, really. But they could do. So let's make sure we've got 4 sentences we can say about it. Physical dependency, long-term use, physiological need for a drug. It's marked by unpleasant withdrawal symptoms after you discontinued, such as delirium tremors with alcohol. In fact, normal day-to-day function is heavily reliant on the substance, like having an alcoholic drink before you go to work or having an alcoholic drink before you get out of bed. Give an example to create depth, remember. Often accompanied by tolerance, but that's a different story. Psychological dependence then. So with this, remember, it sounds similar to physical dependency, but you must talk about psychological constructs. So the condition exists when a person must take the drug in order to satisfy intense mental and emotional cravings. So obviously that's something in your head, isn't it? So that's what the psychology bit there. The individual feels and thinks that they cannot cope with work and life without a specific drug. It might just be in their mind. An absence of the drug makes them have these kind of psychological constructs like anxiety, irritability, or depression. It's all in the mind, Then you've got tolerance, the diminishing effect with regular use of the same dose of the drug, the same dose, requiring the user to take larger and larger doses before experiencing the same effect. That's kind of like nearly a 2-mark winning sentence, very detailed. Larger and larger dose to get the same effect, and there are 3 different ways, of course, that tolerance can develop. Metabolic tolerance, which is more physiological and enzyme related. Neuroadaptation, so that's more neurological. And then you've got the behavioural bit about learned tolerance, learning to cope with the deliberate effects of drugs. And then you've got withdrawal, unpleasant physical and psychological effects following discontinued use. Can include shakes, tremors, vomiting blood pressure, vomiting, blood pressure, heart rate changes. Depends on the drug. I like it when you can talk about specific things from specific drugs. For example, delirium tremors with alcohol cessation, or going cold turkey with heroin cessation. 2 types, of course: acute withdrawal, pretty done within hours or weeks after that. Then post-acute withdrawal, so slowly brain reorganises itself and can take months and years. I think for cocaine cessation it takes about 100 days for your brain to kind of try to rebalance. So you've got those 4 terms, nothing they can ask you on this page, so let's just blitz over that. And then we've got risk factors, okay, let's go down to them. Now I always say to students, if you could talk about any risk factors, which one would you talk about first? So I want you to all have that plan really. So if it was an open choice, you've got 5 risk factors here, which one would you talk about first? Now, personality is tempting, but my worry with that is you don't go deep enough. Stress is a bit better. Peer groups, are you going to talk about just social learning theory per se and forget the addiction bit? But genetic influences, family influences, there's loads to talk about. It's up to you. Play to your strengths, okay? Play to your strengths. But if you're going to talk about personality, make sure it's in full sentences and try to create some depth. Now, obviously, they can ask you about each one of them. And this is another one of my concerns for this year, making sure you are on your toes for risk factors. I'm sure you can see in all your end of topic tests and and assessments. You've done a lot on this, okay? Typically applying to a scenario. So look how things are phrased, okay? Addictive personality tends to see key traits of the cause of addictions. Dispositional factor is appealing because it can explain why some become addicted and others don't, despite experiencing the same thing. So drugs don't change their mode of action depending on the person, but some are drawn to them and some are not. Why is that? Well, it must have something to do with individual differences. But saying this term instead of individual differences, dispositional factor, can win additional marks. Use terminology like we suggest. Now, all of these personality traits, these super traits, are from Eysenck, but bearing in mind, Eysenck wasn't the person who linked them to drug addictions. That's come later down the line, but he provided the framework for us. So, here I'm sure you can see it's breadth over depth, which is rare for us in psychology, but there's little bits you can say. So, extroversion. Those extroverts chronically under-aroused and as such engage in addictive behaviours to gain stimulation, to raise arousal in the central nervous system to optimum or homeostatic levels. So things are balanced. Yeah. So if you've got under-aroused central nervous system, engage in addictive behaviours like drug taking, because you know that raises activity in the central nervous system. You know cocaine excites serotonin and dopamine, just like amphetamine-based drugs. So not a lot, so a couple of sentences really. Neuroticism. People high on this trait experience negative affect like anxiety and may engage in addictive behaviours to alleviate tension for a form of self-medication. I'm sure you've heard that rubbish saying like drown your sorrows when you've got stress by drinking alcohol. That just doesn't work. It just stops you actually dealing with the issue. And then psychoticism relates to sensation sinking, impulsivity and being emotionally detached. Eysenck suggested that this is also related to dopamine function, so people may engage in addictive behaviours to optimise their dopamine function, suggesting people high on this trait are more susceptible to addictions to raise dopamine. So literally, you can see all of these are literally about worth 2 marks. And the last thing we thrown in was Cloninger work on the tridimensional theory of addiction, saying people high on these traits, novelty seeking, those seeking new things, inhibited, so switched off, harm avoidance, not focusing on the danger that it could present, and those who are reward dependent, extremely vulnerable to substance abuse. So again, you can get a couple of marks for that. But the key trait for all of this is impulsivity. Okay, let's have a look at some of the strong evaluation of this. Evidence. And the evidence here, look, is by that study by Cow and Su, which had over 2,500 Chinese adolescents in school. They did loads of personality tests and what have you, and they found some personality traits were linked to one addiction called internet addiction. Okay, there's excessive details here which you don't need. 64 students were suffering from it, but the important part is in bold, look. Those who were suffering from internet addiction had high scores on neuroticism, so that negative effect, and psychoticism, something to do with their dopamine function in comparison groups. This provides convincing support for the role of personality in internet addiction, not addiction per se. So then we've got weakness. Hold on a minute. There's a cause and effect issue here. This is a great weakness, it really is. Points out a lot of personality research is correlational, and although many personality traits are common amongst addicts, they do not necessarily predict addictive behaviour. And what's more, we don't know what came first, the addiction or the personality trait. Surely you can see the idea that people might experience a negative affect or neuroticism if they become addicted to a drug and they don't have access to it. Surely you can see that. So we've got this main problem of what comes first, the addictive personality traits or the addiction. And we've got the capability of changing our brains and personality based on our behaviours if we think about plasticity. So that's your best strength, that's your best weakness. There are more things you can talk about, of course. Big correlation between addictive personality disorder. There's a big correlation between alternative explanations, can explain this. Adolescent incorporates many personal related risk factors, so maybe it's something to do with adolescence. And then you've got more evidence, linking further personality disorders with addictions. And this is work of Verheul, very convincing, estimated 44% of alcoholics, 70% of cocaine addicts, and 79% of heroin addicts have got personality disorders. There's got to be something there. Even more common against those who are taking many drugs. And then you've got this other point down here. In fact, this is only half the story, because some personality traits make you less vulnerable to addiction, such as if you develop hardiness or resilience. Okay. So you don't necessarily have to have the points I've got here, but definitely evidence, please. Definitely evidence and cause and effect. And hold on, it's not telling you the whole story here. So you see, for me, personality is very tempting as long as I create 2 to 3 sentences on each of these factors. It's very tempting for me to do as one of my favourite kind of like risk factors. Then you got stress, and again, I'm sure myself and your teachers have told you to make sure you're using terminology. Phrase it like this. According to the tension reduction hypothesis, people may engage in addictive behaviours in an attempt to reduce tension and anxiety. In other words, they self-medicate. We know tension creates heightened sense of arousal, and we know that addictive behaviours tend to reduce that arousal. For example, alcohol reducing concerns in the short term, or cannabis abuse reducing worries in the short term. Then you can go down to different types of stressors. Works well, got a couple of marks there in everyday stress. Then you've got a couple of marks in traumatic stress, or what do we call this sometimes, chronic stressors or acute stressors. Doesn't matter what you call them really. But I want the percentages and I want the detail. There's at least 2 marks in traumatic stress, at least 2 marks in everyday stress. Tempting, very tempting. So again, evidence. We know alcohol dependency is twice as common in people with social phobias and without. So presuming the anxiety and stress from social phobias, bearing in mind it is an anxiety condition, is linked to that alcohol dependency. And you can also talk about Buckley, remember, from schizophrenia. A couple of bits. That would be a good strong point if you cited both of those studies there, wouldn't it? Yep. Then you've got the individual differences that need to be taken into account. It's not just stress, it's how that person responds to it. People high in hardiness, who are in control, see life as a challenge and are committed to life goals, they tend to buffer the effects of stress and don't turn to addictions. Then you've got more evidence. Always for me, evidence. Yeah. And this is evidence about university students and what preceded addiction here. What addictions were they talking about? It's always specific, you need to mention that. Smoking, alcohol and internet addiction. Those who went off to university, those who are highly stressed, feeling less. Those who are highly stressed students tended to develop addictive disorders, specifically these ones, okay? So useful. And again, you know, there's a cause and effect issue. Does the addiction cause the stress, or does the stress cause the addiction? Similar patterns, yeah? So again, for me, stress is a very tempting one to talk about. Lots to talk about. Peer groups. Now, I don't like them. If I had the choice, I would avoid peer groups because I'm just too concerned that you drift off on to social learning theory without talking about the specific bits needed to gain marks, or social identity theory without talking about specific bits. So for me, peer influence is one of my last choices if I had a choice. But you do have to go over it, okay? So make sure you go over it carefully. Got strong evaluation from it, of course. Sussman and Amis research shows that peer use of drugs was one of the best predictors of future use by others, so it's useful. Yeah, we know peer networks are only really important at certain ages. Sometimes it's parents before peers, and then it's obviously our partners after that. So it tends to be time specific, the influence of peers. And then again, it's correlational, same patterns emerging. Yeah, are we drawn to addictions, which then make us form friendship groups with people who increase our accessibility? Or are we friends with people that are into addictions and cause us to be addicted? You know, which comes first? Hard to measure. But then you've got a good practical application come out of this in health promotions. You're trying to challenge social norm interventions and trying to challenge adolescent views of certain addiction problems in our society. Useful. Genetic influences. Now, the thing with genetics, if you phrase it right, you can get loads of marks for this. Look how we phrase it at the top. Some genes have created a genetic vulnerability in developing addictive behaviours. Yeah. Happy explain why some become addicted to others having just sampled them, where others do not. So it's similar to personality. Yeah, those drugs don't change their mode of action. Then you've got this idea about the faulty, make sure you say faulty, A1DRD2 gene. In effect, reduces the number of dopamine receptors in our pleasure centres, means those with this variant are less sensitive to rewards and may seek out stimulating activities like gambling or cocaine addiction, which both stimulate dopamine. So even with just this bit here, we've got about 4 or 5 marks already. Yeah. Blum have called this the reward deficiency syndrome, so tie it all together. In other words, reward deficiency syndrome, you've got far less dopamine receptors, so you need more rewards. It's linked to all sorts of different compulsive disorders. For example, 69% of a sample of alcohol-dependent users had this, 51% of cocaine-dependent users has this. It's highly prevalent. Then you've got evidence, of course, Shields, 42 pairs of twins, and smoking addiction. Only 9 were discordant, which means 33 were all smoking. There's got to be something about genetics there. But remember, as ever, things can be passed down through multiple means. Just because they go across intergenerations doesn't mean to say it's genetic. It could easily be learned. Then you've got a more comprehensive explanation. If you paste this together with environmental explanations, you get a real thorough diaphysis stress account, which means it's far more holistic, far more realistic as well, I would suggest. And this is another great point, look, we're trying to create these normothetic laws, but the issue is, neglect to consider free will, and other people with this variant, other people don't have any addictive problems. It's common, 1 in 5 in society, but also those suffering from OCD and Tourette syndrome may also suffer from this variant. So it's not pathognomic, remember, that silent G to addiction behaviours. So again, you can see the ones I'm leaning to already: stress, genetics and personality. Family influences, again, I've got this risk here now. I've got this risk that if you talk about social learning theory, you're going to drop off the important parts. Got a good example here. Pause the video if you haven't seen this before. Look how I've tried to use all the concepts of social learning theory. Vicarious learning, direct reinforcements, role models, his parents, smoking cannabis, experiencing the so-called positive effects like relaxation after work. This vicarious reinforcement could have encouraged Carl to engage with cannabis abuse, as these role models are seen as powerful, similar and gender specific. They are highly likely to hold his attention. As it happens time and time again, it's going to be retained in memory, especially if things are seen again and again and again. Are you able to reproduce this behaviour? You see people preparing dangerous drugs, and maybe you've got access to supplies, motivated to repeat it, and therefore will repeat it. So if you're going to use social learning theory, it has to hit the important parts of the cognitive mediating factors and powerful role models like, higher status role models, or same level role models like peers, equal status, sorry. Then you've got these good bits here. Families have also shaped our expectancies about schemas. I know some of you handle that really well. And parenting styles. If you're going to talk about parenting styles, make sure you get it correct. Neglectful parenting. And there's permissive parenting. Remember, they're the ones. So I don't mind you talking about social learning theory, but the risk is you don't talk about it in a sophisticated manner, which is going to win loads of marks. Go over this bit carefully if you're going to use social learning theory. It'd work. Then you've got evaluating family influences, you've got Goddard's research, then you've got Murray's work saying you're 7 times less likely to smoke if families are seen as anti-smoking. Good. Contradictory evidence, of course, from genetics. And then peers, it neglects to consider other important roles. Peers do become really important at certain ages, maybe replace family influences, but it has got good practical application. So you can see where I'm leading to, okay? So make sure you go over your risk factors well. Make sure you've got a couple up your sleeve if you had a choice. I think for going over it now, you can see I'll be pointed towards personality, stress, and family influences, really. Genetics has got loads as well, saying that. Anyhow, play to your strengths. Then we've got nicotine addiction, okay? And we've got to go over 2 explanations. I think this time I'm probably a little bit more conscious about, a little bit more conscious this time about biological explanations, I guess. You can never guess this, you have to revise it all. So you know, if you need to, in a big long essay, we'll talk about candidate genes which can increase our risk of smoking, like a variation on that. Can make us engage in smoking horrible cigarettes which activate dopamine, you know that. But the mode of action, of course, you can see I've taken this from mark schemes and so on. Quick 2 marker stimulates and increases the production of dopamine, therefore we are going to do that again because we like that rewarding behaviour. And then you've got the whole swaddle, which incorporates acetylcholine or nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, the ventral tegmental area, and then the nucleus accumbens, which floods the system. Then you've got a backup as well, talking about, hold on a minute, you have to be conscious that it also increases and stimulates endorphins, which reduce GABA. So we see even more dopamine flood in the system. Go over this pattern, please. Go over this pattern carefully. but you've got a newer version in your booklet. And as a backup, you can also talk about downregulation. Downregulation, the work of Schachter and his nicotine regulation model. Not necessarily think you'll need that. If you do this well, yeah, you probably won't need that. Okay, straight to the evaluation. Important study here, look. Patterson found support for the role of nicotine and dopamine through research with an epilepsy drug called gamma-vinyl GABA. Gamma-vinyl GABA, so it's like a synthetic GABA, if you like. Reduces a surge of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens that occurs after nicotine, so people can smoke when they're on this drug and they won't feel any rewards. And arguably, it's got very few side effects. So we know a drug that blunts the effect of nicotine, on dopamine is very effective. So we know dopamine's involved. Got useful practical applications, of course. That's our typical strengths, isn't it? Yeah, nicotine replacement therapy, and just a little bit of information. Inhalers have been shown to keep 28% of treatment groups off cigarettes for 12 months. You see a northern term I've put in there. And then you've got a beta bias. It neglects to consider differences in males and females. We know women typically start smoking much later than men, and why is that ignored? So it does suffer from a beta bias, and please cite those researchers if you're going to say that. And it only focuses on the nature side, it doesn't talk about nurture, does it? Which is a limitation of this, but it's very scientific. You can measure dopamine and nicotinic acetylcholine through sophisticated PET scans, or just dopamine residue through urine or cerebrospinal fluids. Obviously, you can't measure nicotinic acetylcholine receptors in urine because they're receptors, they're still in the brain. Okay, good. And then you've got cue reactivity. Let me just double check on this one. Yeah, it's come quite recently, a couple of years ago, but that means nothing, okay? And remember, for a big long essay, we write it in detail and look again, if you haven't done this well, how you can apply social learning theory to the initiation of smoking if you do it carefully with important terminology. Have a look, make a note of it. Then you've got the idea of immediate reinforcers, and again, the neglect of long-term consequences, which is obviously according to Skinner, we're empty organisms and we haven't got the capacity to consider long-term stuff. This is not cognitive myopia, even though it sounds very similar to it. This is just we focus on short-term gains. Yeah, it's harder to save money, you know that. And then we can just label some of those things. Then we've got peer acceptance as well as a specific form of positive reinforcement. And then you've got negative reinforcement if you think about withdrawal. And this bit, which is named on the spec, this cue reactivity, which is a different way of saying classical conditioning, isn't it? Yeah, make sure you go over that, please. And maybe draw it if you want as extra marks also. Then typical ways of evaluating. Look, here's a practical application. You can talk about cue exposure involving presenting the cues. That ties very neatly to cue reactivity. Cue reactivity feels led to useful cue exposure, of course. Or you could talk about aversion therapies. They're still based on classical conditionings. You've got this real good comment now from Robinson and Berridge. It doesn't explain why some are drawn to the addictive behaviours and the reinforcers and some are not. There must be something going on there. Like maybe they've got those dangerous personality traits or vulnerable genetics. Great point to include. Deterministic, let's say it properly. Environmental determinism, okay. Environmental determinism here. And then maybe it does work with both biochemical explanations. And then you've got another strong point. Evidence by Harroway. Make sure you cite the researcher's name. Or if you haven't used that study, whatever study you've used, make sure you cite their names. And then it is scientific as well, remember. Yeah, so it's a similarity with the other explanation, is it's quite scientific, it's open to observation. Okay, let's go down to our gambling explanations. Gambling explanations. So nothing there really. Remember, these bits are just for essays, modelling and reinforcement, and then you can apply cue reactivity. But this is what they want off you really. They want partial and variable reinforcement schedules. Make sure you know these well, people. Yes, good way of getting you to apply knowledge here. Yeah, so remember, interval means time and ratio means number of tries. So fixed time, fixed games, variable time, variable games. Yeah, so you can see it's pretty open. Good. Oh, lovely. I've got these pointers here. Okay. Evidence, 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 evidence. They miss the thrill, 40% relapse because they miss the thrill or the buzz, the positive reinforcement. Again, practical applications come out of the learning approach, of course. Yeah, talk about any sort of behavioural therapy. Maybe you could talk about aversion therapy. Maybe you can talk about the use of even, what's it called? Pavlok for gambling addiction. You can use that. Helps it. 500,000 people suffering from that in the UK alone. Alternative evidence, if you say it well, more scientific, you'll get marks for that. But again, doesn't explain why some are drawn and some are not. Make sure you're speaking about gambling addiction and not just addiction per se. And this one I think is more important this year. Think about this in an essay, right? Cognitive explanation of gambling. Faulty information processors who get an early mark already. They don't process wins and losses the same way as me and you do. Yeah? It means they're making a series of misattributions or misexplanations about their addiction. For example, they see a loss as a near miss. No, you only win or lose. That's how it works. You win or lose. Then you've got these early bits if it's like a long essay, but I don't know if you'll need them really. If you go straight down to the cognitive biases named on the spec. So you've got cognitive myopia, that's one I would definitely use. Gambler's fallacy, I'd do that with an example, it would work well. Then I'll pick maybe 3 of these maximum. Obviously this is a staff booklet, so I've got a load here. But I'd definitely pick 2 or 3 of them maximum. Because if you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and you're using this introduction, like in this type of wording, then you'll have enough for description, you would. Then you've got your evidence, great study here by Griffiths from Nottingham University. I don't know if he's still there, but he was at the time. So fruit skill, regular gamblers, not addicts, they weren't classified as addicts, but regular gamblers, non-regular gamblers. Could easily evaluate that, couldn't you? Practical application, well, I'm saying you could easily evaluate it, but we're not going to do that because we need to be focused on the explanation if you're pushed. Practical application, of course, CBT, look, and we've got some details about how it works, useful. Alternative explanations, of course we have, yeah, especially Black's research, yeah, there's got to be some genetics involved. And of course, anything cognitive, of course, you know the drill. Anything cognitive, is that a cause or is that an effect of the gambling? Very useful, very useful. Then you've got reducing addiction, so a big topic on the exam last year. And you've got lots of different ways, 4 different ways. Drug therapy, aversion therapy, covert sensitization and CBT. Given the choice, open question. I know they're all named on the spec, but given a choice, which one would you do? Which one would you do? For the taking, I think all of them. I think my students know I've got a love of aversion therapy, sharp therapy, but I've also really fond of CBT for anything and everything. Yeah, way forward for me. If you're going to talk about drug therapy, make sure you use terminology, antagonist drugs or agonist drugs. And you've got examples here. Yeah, you've got examples here. And then you've got agonist substitutions. Look how it's phrased, yeah? Nicotine replacement therapy delivers therapeutic dose of nicotine without the undesirable parts of tobacco, namely tar. This release of nicotine is absorbed much more slowly and readily than in tobacco. There's different forms of it, yeah? Inhalers are seen as most useful because it mimics a psychological behaviour of smoking. And then you've got the mode of action, very specific, yeah? Obviously, because it's nicotine, it's going to be the same as nicotine, but without the tar and the unwanted carcinogens. Then you've got the antagonist drug of bupropion. Again, very specific way of mode of action here, please. I don't know, for me, it can work quite well, but it just feels unusual using a strong antidepressant in the treatment of smoking cessation. Unusual. The evidence. Depends which one you pick. I'd probably go nice and easy. I've got a stent down here. Here, big meta-analysis looking at NRT. Found those who used NRT 70% more likely to stay away from smoking for 6 months after quitting. Useful. But is it really helping smokers? It's still risky stuff, you know. It's still risky stuff. You have to specify some of those risks. But remember, as with all drug therapies, what happens when you stop taking the drug? Often the behaviours or the chemicals in your brain return to normal. Yeah, it does nothing about faulty cognitions or learned associations or the faulty genes people may have. So relapse seems to be inevitable, you know, in contrast to the kind of inoculating effects of CBT. Think about the language you use. Yeah. And then it is tempting though, and actually, let's face it, it's helped loads and loads and millions of people stop smoking. So it's got to be worthy of something. Yeah, very little time taken up, no time out of work, so little motivation is required. But also with all drug therapies, they seem to remove individual responsibility. And is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't think it's a good thing at all. Then you've got behavioural interventions. Remember, they come with an aim. They come with an aim. Work on the principle of association, try to replace positive associations to addictions with aversive negative associations. Originally designed for alcohol, apply to all sorts of different things. If you're going to talk about alcohol alone, remember antabuse is the emetic they use, and when that basically switches off enzymes and makes it try and get out your booze out of your system really, really quickly. And then you complete olfactory tests to examine the overt behavioural responses. You can see most of this is shaped around alcohol, but different forms have been applied. People should know about Pavlok, an electric shock device which smokers or gamblers could get hold of. And then you've got obviously rapid smoking. So loads to talk about aversion therapy. This is tempting, surely. Yeah. Then you've got the evaluation, very useful studies in America, 82 alcoholics. Just to illustrate, it was done in 10 days this year. 10 days. And alcohol dependency can cripple people. But some effectiveness within 10 days. Don't start having a whinge about the ethical problem of aversion therapy, please, without doing it in a sophisticated way. Short-term problems, long-term benefits. So in other words, it's an ethical dilemma. It does present problems in the short term, but in the long terms, it removes problems. Don't be so close-minded to say it's a major ethical problem if you phrase it in such a sophisticated way. But again, like all behavioural treatments, doesn't do anything about the underlying factors such as faulty cognitions or really risky personality factors and so on. You have to question its long-term effectiveness, but it's fairly scientific. And then you've got kind of like in vitro, haven't you? In vitro aversion therapy, which is looking at covert sensitisation, and I guess quite useful for things that you cannot bring into the therapeutic room. Yeah, difficult. Go through it carefully. Has some benefits of this, especially for behavioural addictions. Yeah, especially for behavioural addictions. Let's face it, when you use aversion therapy, you can't develop it so it uses enzymes to switch off all addictions. So maybe for behavioural addictions, you'd be leaning towards more kind of covert sensitisation. Good evidence. Less ethical dilemmas with this therapy. Limited again because it doesn't do anything about faulty cognitions. But it's less scientific as well, isn't it, I'm afraid? It's far less scientific because you have to rely on the imagination, which relies more on inferences than other therapies. Now this is my favourite, of course, CBT for addictions. Make sure we talk about specific issues with CBT with addictions like cognitive reframing, functional analysis and relapse prevention. I think you could probably get away with 2 of these 3, really. Probably could. Especially if you do it in a way which is kind of given an example here. Yeah. You've got your evaluation, Ledusa's great evidence, 66, 86, yeah. But, it's limited really, 86 gamblers in the US of A, but then you've got real powerful studies by Miller saying CBT emerged the most effective treatment for alcoholism. We've crossed 381 studies. Yeah, so it works for gambling, works for alcohol. And then we've got even more ideas. It works for further illicit drug use if you look at McGill's work. So really generalisable. Yeah, but it requires motivation. It certainly is not a quick fix. Something to be conscious of. Then we've got the models, the models of behavioural change. We've got this, and remember, these are just models of behavioural change which you have to apply to addiction. They haven't already been applied to addiction, so you need to apply them. Remember, it's got to be detailed, 3 marks on behavioural attitude, 3 marks on subjective norms, 3 marks on perceived behaviour control. So pause the video if you haven't got your 3 marks worth. You can see it's nearly in sentences. Doom, doom, doom. Yeah, boom, boom, boom. And then you've got perceived behavioural control. So that's a good point. What if they ask you to describe behavioural intentions? Yeah, well, it's a cognitive and conscious plan to do something, which is constructed in 3 different elements. One is called subjective norm, which is not social norms, it's more the social norm of your reference group. And then you'd contribute with perceived behavioural control and you contribute with the behavioural attitude. And you talk about those 3 things constructing this. Then you've got the, applying this. I can see them asking you applying questions on these type of topics. Applying to a scenario. That could be explaining someone's addiction, or it could be trying to challenge someone's addiction. got loads on this, look. Evidence, best evidence we could find, or I could certainly find here, was Hager. Maybe your teachers found better stuff, but it was a huge multinational study for a multinational company. Yeah, looking across behaviours in 4 different countries: Estonia, Finland, Sweden and UK, and found, yeah, there's evidence for it, but maybe not in binge drinking. I think that's what it says somewhere. Yeah, didn't explain binge drinking, I'm afraid. It doesn't say that there. But it's too rational. It suggests that you plan to have addictions, yeah? It's too conscious. That doesn't happen. We know full well that some addictions are developed through emotional reasons, if you think about the role of stress. But useful in therapy, of course, because it's based on CBT. Well, it can be utilised in CBT. And then again, you've got the cause and effect stuff because it's cognitive. But then you've got Prochaska's 6-stage model, and for an essay, you know, we might use things like this. It's a process, pre-active stages, post-action stages. Remember those 6 stages, and I've got loads of detail here, probably more than you could ever need. But they could really ask you any one of these stages, yeah, for up to 4 marks, you know. Name and outline stage 3 of Prochaska's model. Always remember this as PCP, pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, and AMT, yeah. So remember, they can ask you about each one of these stages if they want to, so you cannot avoid it. Evidence as ever, yeah, it can be tailor-made in therapy, ideal. And then you've got, hold on a minute, some contradictory evidence which may suggest it's unreliable. And we've got this idea, do we need all these stages? Surely the planning stage has got something to do with action, yeah? And maintenance has got something to do with action. Do we need 6 stages? And then you've got the cultural relativism of it. Yeah, there's subtle cultural differences when you apply it to different cultural settings, which is worthy of comment. So that's it, really. That's it. So if it hasn't made it clear as I've been going through this, I'd certainly make sure I'm on my toes for risk factors. Certainly make sure I'm on my toes for defining addiction. The cognition and gambling I'm conscious of. Cognition and gambling, and more kind of like biological explanations of nicotine addiction. And as well as that, the theory of planned behaviour. So I've not condensed it for you, but I've just told you 1, 2, 3, 5 areas to like focus your final efforts in. Okay, you must revise it all though. Okay, risk factors, defining addiction, theory of planned behaviour, cognition and gambling, and bio-explanation of the nicotine addiction are real concerning topics of mine. Okay, I hope that helps. But listen, that's video 2 of 4. I'll hopefully produce and share with you video 3 tomorrow, and then certainly video 4 by Friday at the very latest. Okay, over and out.